Hello and welcome to my Facts, Fiction, and Stories, where I explain biology concepts in a fun and easy way. Today, we are going to learn about cell membrane transport, which is how molecules move across the cell membrane. DNA. The cell membrane is a thin layer of phospholipids and proteins that surrounds the cell and separates it from the outside environment. The cell membrane is not just a barrier, but also a gatekeeper that regulates what goes in and out of the cell. Door. There are two main types of cell membrane transport: passive transport and active transport. Passive transport does not require any energy from the cell, while active transport does. Let's see how they work. Eyes. Passive transport. Passive transport is when molecules move across the cell membrane from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration, following their concentration gradient. This means that they move from where they are more to where they are less, until they reach an equilibrium. This is like when you spray perfume in one corner of the room, and it gradually spreads to the rest of the room. Wind-blowing phase. There are three types of passive transport: simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. Simple diffusion. Simple diffusion is when small and nonpolar molecules, such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, and ethanol, can directly cross the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane without any help from proteins. They dissolve into the lipid layer across it, and then dissolve into the aqueous solution on the other side. This happens because these molecules are hydrophobic, meaning that they do not like water, so they prefer to stay in the lipid layer. Droplet. Facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion is when larger or polar molecules such as glucose, amino acids, and ions need the help of special proteins called permeases or transporters to cross the cell membrane. These proteins act like channels or carriers that allow these molecules to pass through the membrane. They are specific for each type of molecule, and they can only transport them in one direction, following their concentration gradient. This happens because these molecules are hydrophilic, meaning that they like water, so they cannot cross the lipid layer by themselves. Splashing sweat symbol. Osmosis. Osmosis is a special type of diffusion that involves water molecules. Water molecules can move across the cell membrane through simple diffusion or through special channels called aquaporins. Osmosis is when water molecules move from a region of low solute concentration to a region of high solute concentration following their concentration gradient. This means that they move from where there is more water to where there is less water, until they reach an equilibrium. This happens because water molecules are attracted to solutes by hydrogen bonds, so they tend to move towards them. Droplet. Osmosis can affect the shape and size of cells depending on the tonicity of the solution they are in. Tonicity is a measure of how much solute is in a solution compared to inside the cell. There are three types of tonicity: hypotonic, isotonic, and hypertonic. A hypotonic solution has less solute than inside the cell, so water will move into the cell by osmosis, causing it to swell and possibly burst. This is like when you put a gummy bear in pure water, and it becomes bigger and softer. Bear face. An isotonic solution has the same amount of solute as inside the cell, so there will be no net movement of water by osmosis, keeping the cell shape and size constant. This is like when you put a gummy bear in sugar water, and it stays the same. Bear face. A hypertonic solution has more solute than inside the cell, so water will move out of the cell by osmosis, causing it to shrink and shrivel. This is like when you put a gummy bear in salt water, and it becomes smaller and harder. Bear face. Active transport. Active transport is when molecules move across the cell membrane from a region of low concentration to a region of high concentration, against their concentration gradient. This means that they move from where they are less to where they are more, creating an imbalance. This requires energy from the cell in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is like the currency of cellular energy. Money bag. There are two types of active transport: primary active transport and secondary active transport. Primary active transport. Primary active transport is when molecules are directly pumped across the cell membrane by proteins called pumps that use ATP as their energy source. These pumps are specific for each type of molecule and they can transport them in both directions, against their concentration gradient. An example of primary active transport is the sodium-potassium pump, which pumps 3 sodium ions out of the cell and 2 potassium ions into the cell for every ATP molecule it uses. This creates an electrochemical gradient, which is a difference in both concentration and charge across the cell membrane. High voltage sign. Secondary active transport. Secondary active transport is when molecules are indirectly transported across the cell membrane by proteins called cotransporters that use the electrochemical gradient created by primary active transport as their energy source. These cotransporters can be uniporters, symporters, or antiporters, depending on how many and which direction they transport molecules. An example of secondary active transport is the glucose-sodium cotransporter, which transports one glucose molecule into the cell along with 2 sodium ions that move down their electrochemical gradient. This allows the cell to take up glucose against its concentration gradient. Sweep. Bulk transport. Bulk transport is when large molecules or particles, such as proteins, polysaccharides, or bacteria, are transported across the cell membrane by vesicles, which are small membrane-bound sacs that can fuse with or pinch off from the cell membrane. There are 2 types of bulk transport: endocytosis and exocytosis. Endocytosis. Endocytosis is when the cell membrane folds inward and forms a vesicle that engulfs a large molecule or particle from the outside environment and brings it into the cell. There are 3 types of endocytosis: phagocytosis, penocytosis, and receptor-mediated endocytosis. Phagocytosis is when the cell membrane forms a large vesicle called a phagosome that engulfs a solid particle, such as a bacterium or a dead cell, and brings it into the cell. The phagosome then fuses with a lysosome, which is an organelle that contains digestive enzymes, and breaks down the particle. This is how some immune cells, such as macrophages, destroy pathogens or foreign invaders. Microbe. Penocytosis is when the cell membrane forms a small vesicle called a penosome that engulfs a droplet of liquid such as extracellular fluid or blood plasma, and brings it into the cell. The penosome then fuses with an endosome, which is an organelle that sorts and recycles molecules and releases its contents. This is how some cells, such as kidney cells, absorb nutrients or hormones. Droplet. Receptor-mediated endocytosis is when the cell membrane forms a coated vesicle that engulfs a specific molecule that binds to a receptor on the surface of the cell membrane. The coated vesicle then fuses with an endosome and releases its contents. This is how some cells, such as liver cells, take up cholesterol or iron magnet. Exocytosis is when a vesicle inside the cell fuses with the cell membrane and releases its contents to the outside environment. This is how some cells, such as nerve cells or gland cells, secrete neurotransmitters or hormones. Brain. That's all for today's video on cell membrane transport. I hope you learned something new and enjoyed watching. If you did, please give this video a thumbs up sign, and subscribe to my channel for more B. Exocytosis. Exocytosis is when a vesicle inside the cell fuses with the cell membrane and releases its contents to the outside environment. This is how some cells, such as nerve cells or gland cells, secrete neurotransmitters or hormones. Brain. That's all for today's video on cell membrane transport. I hope you learned something new and enjoyed watching. If you did, please give this video a thumbs up sign, and subscribe to Facts, Fiction, and Stories for more biology videos.